Hi guys, this is Dr. Gonzalez, and I'm going to take you through the different types of variables that are essential in experimental research. So, variables are the key parts of an experimental research. A variable is by definition anything that can change or vary. In an experimental research situation, researchers are going to manipulate one or more variables, and then they measure the outcome based on that. They also need to control other factors that could interfere with the results. So the goal in this situation is to test whether a change in one variable is directly responsible for causing a change in another variable. Variables help researchers organize the study, and they provide a specific clarification of what exactly is being tested. There are three major variables that we're concerned with. The independent variable is what you, the researcher, is manipulating or changing. The dependent variable, which is often called the response variable, is what we're going to measure. And then control variables are factors that we keep constant or consistent across groups. So how do these things work together? The IV creates our comparison, and the DV captures the outcome. And then control variables reduce alternative explanations. Let's talk about the independent variable a bit more. We often refer to it as the IV, and this is the variable that the researcher is manipulating. The IV is the cause or the treatment condition in the experiment. And we change that IV to see if it produces a change in an outcome variable. So when you're selecting an IV, it must be something that you, the researcher, can assign or manipulate. So here's an example. If a study is asking whether sleep affects memory, the IV might be the amount of sleep. Now, independent variables can have different levels, and we'll talk much more about this when we get into specific research designs that fall under experimental methodology. Research question in this example is, how does sleep duration affect memory? So our independent variable here would be sleep duration, which is how long someone's going to sleep. And you can see here it has possible 4 different levels, 4, 6, or 8 hours. So what the researcher is going to do is he's going to compare memory performance across those different sleep conditions. So in other words, if the condition is 4 hours, how is their memory performance? Again, if it's 6 hours, how is their memory performance? And if it's 8 hours, how is its memory performance? The DV, or the dependent variable, is the outcome that we're measuring. It's expected to change because of the independent variable. And so in other words, this is the effect of the experiment. And our DV should always be measurable, specific, and directly connected to the research question. So an example, if the independent variable is sleep duration, the DV might be the score on a memory test. Dependent variables have to be measured clearly and consistently. We have to define exactly how the outcome could be measured. So that might be a quiz score, reaction time, number of correct answers, self-reported anxiety ratings, writing quality score, time spent on a task, or a score on a reading comprehension test. Here are some examples. So if our research question is, how do smartphone notifications affect reading comprehension? Our variable types for our IV are notification condition. Why does this matters? This matters because this is what the researcher is changing. The levels of the IV would be notifications on versus notifications off. And those are going to be our comparison groups. And the dependent variable in this situation is a reading comprehension score. And that is the outcome measured after we have conducted our manipulation. So in other words, the researcher changes notification exposure and measures whether comprehension changes. Now, another group of variables you need to be concerned with are control variables. These are factors that the researcher tries to keep the same across all groups. Why is this important? Well, these help us prevent outside factors from influencing our results. They make a comparison between the groups more fair, and they strengthen our internal validity by reducing alternative explanations. So in other words, if groups differ in too many ways, the researcher might not know what actually caused our outcome. In an experiment with smartphone notifications and reading comprehension, possible control variables can include things like the same reading passage for all participants, the same amount of time to read, the same number of questions, the same testing environment, the same instructions, and the same device or format that's used to complete the task. Control variables matter because they help us reduce alternative explanations. So suppose one group reads a difficult passage and another group reads an easier passage. If the groups have different comprehension scores, the difference might be due to the passage difficulty rather than the manipulated independent variable. So by controlling the reading passage, our researcher makes the experiment more valid. So this is just a nice little table here that is giving us info related to the research question, how does retrieval practice affect retention of course material compared to rereading notes? Our variables are independent variable, study method, and why it matters, retrieval practice, compared with rereading notes. Our dependent variable is our retention of material, and we're going to measure that by quiz score. And our control variables include materials, time, quiz, and conditions, and this matters because we want to keep consistent all of these things across groups so that they're compared fairly. Common mistakes. Correlation instead of experiment. A common mistake when we're writing a research question is that if we're only looking at two variables that are related. In a non-experimental situation, we have questions like, is screen time related to anxiety? Well, we can correlate those things, but that doesn't imply causation. But in an experiment, we're looking at things like, how does exposure to social media content affect self-reported anxiety? Now, two questions to keep these two variables straight. What is being changed by the researcher is indicative of our independent variable. What we're measuring as an outcome is always going to be our DV. The IV first comes logically because we are testing a causal relationship between our independent variable and our dependent variable. So the variable that you, the researcher, is changing is your IV, and the measured variable is going to be our DV. So when you're choosing your research question, you need to be able to identify my independent variable, levels of that independent variable, the dependent variable, the control variables, the comparison groups, and the expected outcome. And if you can't identify those parts, your question might need to be revised. So here's a practice example of AI and writing quality. The research question is, what differences in writing quality are found between students who use AI assistance and students who use standard writing techniques? So our IV in this example is writing method. And what we're looking at is AI-assisted writing versus standard writing techniques. Our dependent variable is writing quality score, and that's going to be measured by a rubric. And our control variables that we want to keep consistent across groups are prompt, time, rubric, word count, and expectations. Now, I want you to choose one research question from the approved list, and then I want you to identify your IV, the levels of the independent variable, and actually for this assignment, we're probably going to leave that out. But I do want you to find your dependent variable and at least two variables that we need to control.